He claimed to be a prophet, a man of peace. But while the faithful called him Elijah, the missing had a different name for him, the death angel. Behind those fences, children disappeared. Silence was weaponized, and obedience meant survival. Until one girl said no, and the prophet's gospel began to bleed. If you have not subscribed to this YouTube channel, please click the subscribe button and turn on notification for other thrilling true crime stories. The first time Clara heard the name Brother Elijah, she was 7 and standing barefoot in the dew-wet grass of her grandmother's backyard in rural Oklahoma. The old woman had pointed toward the sunrise and said, "That's the time of day God speaks clearest. That's when Elijah walks." Clara hadn't asked what she meant. In her family, there were things you didn't question. You just accepted. You bowed your head. You kept your voice soft. The prophet, even then, was a myth wrapped in cotton and scripture, too big for a child's doubt, too old for a child's fear. By the time she was 12, she had met him. It was at a gathering outside Tulsa. Not a church, not exactly, but a fenced-in camp with a white tent, plastic chairs, and people who all called each other brother and sister. There was no yelling, no fire and brimstone like the TV preachers, just quiet songs and the sound of wind through trees. He walked among them like a grandfather dressed in tan linen, barefoot even on gravel. He placed his hands gently on heads. When he reached Clara, he smiled as if he already knew her name. "Your spirit is not lost," he told her. "It's just been waiting for the right home." She followed her mother there every Sunday for years. They called the group the Restoration Assembly. Officially, they were a ministry. Unofficially, they were a family. That's what they told each other, and it was easy to believe. No one raised their voice. No one cursed. They shared meals, wore modest clothes, and turned in their phones at the gate. No one asked why. In the beginning, it didn't feel like control. It felt like safety. The world outside was loud, mean, dangerous. People overdosed. People vanished. People screamed at each other in Walmart parking lots. Inside the compound, there were gardens, chores, rules, predictability. Brother Elijah didn't just preach. He assigned jobs, arranged marriages, settled disputes. He spoke softly but never hesitated. You obeyed because he never gave you a reason not to. It took Clara until she was 16 to notice the locked rooms. They weren't in the chapel or the dorms. They were beneath the food cellar, in a corridor hidden behind stacks of canned peaches. One night, while fetching supplies, she heard a sound, not loud, but sharp, a whimper. She pressed her ear against the wall and heard it again. The next day, the cellar was sealed. Brother Elijah said it had been contaminated by mold. No one questioned it. 3 months later, 2 boys Clara had grown up with, twins, Lucas and Levi, were gone. Their mother cried during a sermon. The next day, she was taken off kitchen duty and reassigned to quiet reflection. When Clara asked where the boys had gone, the answer was simple. They were not ready for the final restoration. Clara didn't ask again. By 18, she had married a man chosen for her, a quiet, stoic farmhand named Micah. He had kind eyes and said very little. They were given a small room in the eastern wing and assigned to livestock care. Clara didn't love him, not in the way novels talked about, but he never hurt her. He was a protector in the way dog protected porches. When she lost their first child in the 7th month, Brother Elijah told her it was a Lord reminder that pain leads to humility, that her womb would open when her soul was clean. She bled for 4 days in silence and prayed through all of them. The twins were never spoken of again. Years passed. New members arrived, broken and eager. Others disappeared. Sometimes they were sent on missions. Sometimes they simply failed to return. Those who questioned too much were asked to fast. Those who fasted long enough forgot what they wanted to know. Then came the boy named Jonah. He was 12 when he arrived, placed by an aunt who had found a pamphlet online. He was wiry, curious, and restless. Clara taught him how to feed the goats. He asked too many questions. Why the gates had locks. Why they couldn't listen to music with drums. Why the assembly didn't allow visit from outside family unless pre-approved by Elijah himself. Jonah was reassigned to silence training. That was the last time Clara saw him for weeks. When he returned, He no longer made eye contact. He didn't hum while working. He didn't ask anything at all. He walked behind Elijah like a ghost with dirt under his fingernails. Clara started counting the silences. How many members had simply disappeared? How many children didn't reach adulthood? How many sermons spoke of shepherding the unready and corrective cleansing? It was Micah who finally broke the spell. Late one night, he whispered to her, "There's a tunnel under the east barn. It goes past the boundary fence. I've used it. Once." She turned to him, heart pounding. "Why?" "Because you're pregnant again," he said, "and I want this one to live." They left in silence 3 nights later, dressed in gardening clothes and carrying only canned beans and a stolen map. They walked for hours through waist-high grass and broken fences, away from the safety of stillness, into the sound of wind and distant traffic. Clara delivered their daughter 2 months later in a women's shelter under a false name. She named the child Grace. They never spoke to reporters, never posted photos, never used their real names. The assembly's influence stretched far. Too many had left before and found their lives dismantled in mysterious ways. Jobs lost, car accidents, investigations opened against them. But that changed when a body was found. Jonah, buried under a shallow grave 20 miles west of the compound, in a stretch of woods known only to a handful of members. He had been missing for 2 years. He was 16. His autopsy revealed old fractures, malnutrition, and the presence of a sedative no longer on the market. There was a tattoo on his wrist that read Asher 7. Authorities had no idea what it meant. Clara did. Asher was the name Elijah gave to those undergoing cleansing. 7 was the final phase. The FBI raided the compound 6 days later. What they found wasn't just a religious commune. It was a psychological machine. Hidden dorms, soundproof rooms, a digital archive of hundreds of indoctrination videos labeled only by numbers. Dozens of missing persons reports suddenly made sense. Brother Elijah was not there. He vanished before the raid. To this day, he has not been found. The news hit the town like an earthquake rolled beneath their feet. People who had once donated clothes to the Assembly's family restoration drives now whispered in checkout lines. Some called it a hoax. Others said they'd always suspected something was wrong. Too quiet, too separate, too clean. But no one had really known. In the days after the raid, 27 survivors were removed from the compound, some willingly, most in silence. 13 were minors, 4 were listed as legally missing. All of them wore the same gray linen uniforms and bore identical tattoos on their wrists, marked Asher or Myra or Sylvie followed by a number. Some still referred to themselves by those names, even as caseworkers pleaded for their real ones. Clara watched it unfold from a motel room in New Mexico. She didn't go to the press. She didn't call anyone, but she did write. Every night, after putting Grace to sleep, she filled pages of cheap notebooks with memories, not to remember, but to burn through them, to extract the poison. She wrote about the room with the yellow walls where girls were made to kneel for hours, about the recorded loops that played while they slept, scripture twisted into submission chants, about the white pills handed out before cleansing evaluations, about the chants they were taught to say backwards as a test of obedience, about the day she saw Levi's sandal floating face down in the livestock pond and no one ever spoke his name again. 2 weeks after the raid, the FBI called her. They had questions only someone like her could answer. At first she hesitated, but Micah told her something that changed her mind. "You're not going back to the fire," he said. "You're walking into the ashes." So she agreed. The interviews took place in a secure facility 3 hours from the compound. She arrived with nothing but her notebooks and a photo of Grace tucked into her wallet. She sat across from agents, trauma psychologists, and forensic linguists who asked questions like, "What does CLV mean? And why are some members listed as unmarked? And have you ever seen a ledger called the Ark?" The last question made her pause. She had, just once. It wasn't paper. It was digital, a secure laptop Brother Elijah carried, and only opened behind closed doors. It was rumored to contain assignments, names of those undergoing spiritual redirection. No one saw it. No one touched it. But Clara had once caught a glimpse over his shoulder, a list of names, dates, and status codes, purified, pending, and gone. Jonah had been on that list. His name had said pending. The agents looked at each other, then at Clara, then down at their folders. They told her they had recovered the laptop. It was encrypted, heavily, but they believed she had just given them the cipher. Clara went home to Grace, but her life didn't return to normal. It couldn't. There were people in the assembly who had not been found, others who had integrated into other towns, other ministries, offshoots, branches. It wasn't over. In Kansas, a woman named Shiloh turned herself in after hearing a podcast about the raid. She brought with her 15 notebooks detailing the Assembly's expansion plan, small satellite communities under different names, each structured with identical hierarchy. Elijah hadn't created one cult. He'd created a blueprint. They called it the Fellowship Model. There were 5 confirmed fellowships operating under different names in Missouri, Utah, Idaho, and South Carolina. 2 of them disbanded quietly after the raid. The others were still active, but under religious exemption status. The government couldn't shut them down without evidence. Clara received threats, anonymous letters, cryptic Bible verses slipped under her door. A man in a gray truck that parked across from her apartment twice in 1 week. She moved again, this time under a federal protection program, not for her safety alone, but because she was now the key witness in what was being shaped as the most extensive cult case since Waco. It would take 2 years before the arc was fully decoded. What it revealed shocked even the most jaded investigators. 6 to 7 names. Of those, 22 were verified alive. 12 were confirmed dead, buried, overdosed, or disappeared after final restoration rituals. The rest? Unknown, presumed relocated, presumed erased. The trial was a media frenzy. Not of Brother Elijah, he was still missing, but of 3 senior lieutenants captured in the raid. Sister Nora, Brother Caleb, a man known only as Daniel First. All 3 were tried for conspiracy, psychological abuse, endangering minors, and involuntary manslaughter. Clara testified. So did Lena, the girl who had escaped years earlier and had been quietly living in Iowa. She came forward after hearing Clara's interview. Her testimony cracked something open, not in the case, but in the survivors watching. Dozens more came forward after that. Not all from the assembly. Some from the fellowships. Some from unnamed groups that used eerily similar language. The phrase final restoration became the symbol of something far more terrifying than doctrine. It was now shorthand for erasure, for ending, for quiet murder in God's name. A memorial was proposed. Clara declined to attend. She didn't want a statue or plaque. She wanted what no one could give, the years back, the choice, the sound of her own voice in her head, uncoached, unscripted, unafraid. She kept Grace out of school for a long time, homeschooled her, taught her how to question, how to shout, how to trust her own fear, how to tell stories that didn't end with obedience. Grace was 10 the first time she asked why they moved so much. Clara told her the truth, because there are still people looking for silence. Grace tilted her head. What does that mean? Clara looked out the window, the desert sun casting long shadows against the floor. It means some people are scared of what a little girl's voice can do if nobody stops her. The FBI never found Elijah, but they found his real name. He was born in Tennessee. His name was Raymond Elledge. He had once worked as a juvenile counselor before disappearing in 1994 under investigation for unorthodox behavioral conditioning. No charges were filed. No convictions. He changed his name and his face, surgically. He vanished into belief. Clara received one last letter before changing her identity for good. It was handwritten, postmarked from rural Texas. It said only, "You were my best disciple. You walked away, but the voice never left you. It echoes, even now. You'll come back when the world is too loud." There was no signature. Clara didn't keep the letter. She burned it and flushed the ashes. Then she turned on the radio, louder than usual. She watched her daughter dance to the noise, and smiled. Before the raids, before the body, before the silence cracked wide open, there were whispers of the White House ritual. Not the presidential one. The Assembly's was older than their compound, held in the chalk-white farmhouse at the heart of the property, a building no one spoke of aloud. It was off-limits to all but the Covenant 12, Elijah's inner circle. Clara had only entered once. It was her 3rd year of marriage, and she had been summoned, not asked. Micah walked her to the door and kissed her knuckles, and when she looked back, he wasn't there anymore. Inside the house, everything smelled like lemon oil and cedar. The curtains were drawn. The hallway was empty. Elijah met her in the sitting room. He did not smile. He simply gestured to a chair and poured tea from a glass pot that steamed like breath in cold air. "You've been obedient, Sister Clara. But obedience without understanding is mimicry. And mimicry is what beasts do." She nodded. His eyes locked onto hers with the force of a trap snapping shut. "I'm going to show you something," he said. "And if you accept it, your voice will carry further than it ever could in rebellion." What he showed her was not violent, not in the traditional sense. It was an old film reel, grainy and flickering. Children in a room repeating phrases. A man's voice off-screen instructing them to mimic patterns, to forget colors, to speak only in numbers. She watched until her jaw clenched and her hands turned to fists in her lap. They were orphans, Elijah said, rescued from chaos. We gave them structure. "We?" Clara asked. He smiled then. "I was once a disciple, too." That was when she first understood. Elijah hadn't invented the assembly. He had inherited it. Over the following months, Clara was given more responsibilities. She taught new girls how to recite backward prayers. She inspected food rations for emotion-triggering substances, mostly sugar, caffeine, or herbs she didn't recognize. She corrected posture, punished trembling, assigned tasks designed to strip away identity. She hated it, but a part of her felt powerful. It wasn't until Jonah arrived that her faith truly cracked. His eyes had been too bright, his laughter too uncoached, his silence afterward too hollow. She hadn't saved him, but his absence saved her. Clara would never speak of what she did during those years, not even to Micah, but she carried the shame like a second name. After the raid, survivors were divided into 3 groups: those who returned to families, those who entered protective care, and those who refused to speak at all. The 3rd group were the deepest scars of the assembly. They spoke in rote phrases even months after removal. They folded their clothes in perfect squares, refused to sleep on beds, and flinched when asked their real names. One boy, registered only as Myronine, gouged out his name tag with a paperclip. Another girl, CLV2, asked if she could go back to the dark room where the questions stopped. It was Shiloh who first used the phrase "spoken fire." She described it as a punishment for those who resisted. Not physical, psychological. Bright lights, overlapping voices, music played in dissonant loops. She said it made you forget the shape of your own name. In one session, she cried when she remembered her mother's voice for the first time in 10 years. "They said my memory was diseased," she whispered, "that they had to cut it out word by word." Shiloh later led federal investigators to a hidden flash drive buried in a mason jar beneath the dormitory rose garden. On it were audio files, thousands of hours long, used in silence rooms. They contained looped confessions, weeping, white noise, and something else, a deep voice layered over with digital reverb, repeating lines like the tongue is a weapon, and obedience is freedom from thought. They confirmed the voice was Elijah's. The search for him widened. Interpol released an alert. Forensic analysts traced money transfers through cryptocurrency launderers linked to shell missions in Ecuador, Honduras, and Morocco. Rumors spread of a man with surgical scars and a wooden cane teaching in a rural ministry on the edge of Bogota. A team was sent. The building was empty. In a locked room, they found a coat sewn with a stitched symbol, a sun pierced by a single vertical line. It matched the one burned into the altar at the assembly compound. They were too late again. Clara refused all interviews, but someone else didn't. A former assembly driver named Mirren came forward anonymously to a podcast called Eyes on the Fringe. He claimed that Elijah traveled between families for years, spreading the quiet gospel and hand-selecting children for cleansing. He said that Elijah believed the world would end in sound, and that silence was the only path to spiritual preservation. Mirren described one ceremony where children were blindfolded, spun in circles, and asked to identify their siblings by voice alone. Those who failed were sent to echo fasting. Weeks without speaking. Some forgot how. One stopped entirely. The clip went viral. Congress held a hearing on spiritual abuse. The term faith cults entered the mainstream lexicon. People debated religious freedom. But survivors like Lena just wanted people to say one thing: that it happened, that it was real, that silence could be a scream too. Clara aged quickly. Trauma wore her spine, not just her face. Grace grew into a bold, inquisitive teenager who asked questions Clara sometimes couldn't answer. One day, Clara found her daughter writing a poem titled The Prophet's Daughter. "What made you write that?" she asked gently. "Because you never told me what his voice sounded like," Grace replied. "I wanted to imagine it so I could forget it before I ever heard it." Clara nodded. And that night, she sat down with Grace and told her everything. Everything. The trial for the 3 assembly lieutenants, Nora, Caleb, and Daniel First, lasted 9 weeks. But their silence lasted longer. All 3 pleaded not guilty. All 3 claimed no knowledge of the disappearances. When presented with survivor testimony, they sat emotionless, occasionally whispering scripture under their breath. Nora refused to look at Lena. Daniel First smirked when Shiloh wept on the stand. Caleb asked for a prayer circle in the courtroom before the closing statements. The jury deliberated for 12 hours. All 3 were found guilty on multiple counts of conspiracy, endangerment, and involuntary manslaughter. But the public wanted more. They wanted Elijah. They wanted a face, a body, a name to attach to the evil that had slipped between laws and faith and faith. They didn't get one, but they got something else. A leak. 3 days after sentencing, an anonymous user uploaded a 42-minute video to a private server. It contained footage recorded on a body cam, worn by a freelance investigator posing as a missionary in a restoration farm in Paraguay. The footage showed a man, gray-bearded, thin, and barefoot, leading morning chants. His voice was unmistakable. Elijah. But his face, it had changed. He bore scars along his jawline. His ears were smaller, his forehead narrower, and his left eye was milky with cataract. But when he smiled, the room went still. He called himself Shepherd Eli. He said the world had not ended in fire or flood, but in noise, that children were being poisoned by sound waves, that obedience was the only armor left. He quoted scripture that didn't exist, mixed Isaiah with user manuals. He had his followers repeat phrases that, when reversed in editing, were confessions. Interpol traced the IP. The farm was already burned down by the time they arrived. But he had left something behind, a child's drawing, crude, with shaking crayon lines, a stick figure with long robes and a group of others kneeling around him. Above the figure were the words, "He is God in the quiet." Clara watched the leak from her kitchen. Grace stood beside her. "Do you think he's dead?" Grace asked. "No," Clara said. "Then how do you live?" Clara didn't answer right away. She walked to the window and opened it. A wind pushed through the curtain, carrying the sound of neighborhood kids laughing, a distant lawnmower, a bird chirping too loudly. "You live," she said finally, "by staying loud." A week later, Grace posted her poem online. The Prophet's Daughter went viral. Not because it was perfect. It wasn't. But because it was real. Because it was loud. She read it on a live stream that reached over 200,000 viewers. Survivors messaged her. Journalists quoted her. Legislators cited it when proposing new spiritual abuse protections. She became the voice her mother never could be. Clara, now in her early 50s, began working with a quiet group of underground survivors who called themselves the Breaths. They published educational content on cult grooming tactics, religious trauma, and the warning signs of soft indoctrination. They operated anonymously. No faces, no names, just sound. Always sound. They held vigils once a year. Not moments of silence, but sound festivals. Drums, chants, stories, laughter, chaos. They called it the Restoration Reclaimed. And yet, despite all the justice, the podcasts, the exposés, one question lingered like an ember. What if Elijah never died? What if he started again? Clara received one final package. No return address. Inside, a tape recorder, old and dusty. No label. She pressed play. The first 5 minutes were static. Then came the sound of a man breathing. And a single phrase, whispered in a voice aged but unmistakable. Even prophets rest. But the word never dies. She smashed the recorder with a hammer. She called no one. She picked up her pen and began writing again. Before Clara became the Assembly's ghost, she was just a girl in the kitchen of her grandmother's farmhouse, learning how to boil eggs and knead dough while scriptures played on an old cassette. Her grandmother, Sister Madeline, was among the earliest known followers of the Restoration doctrine, long before it became a compound or cult. Back then, it was called the Practice. They met in fields, read from copied pages of a so-called Second Testament, and believed that modern noise was a spiritual disease. Sister Madeline never raised her voice. She said loudness summoned demons. She burned a television in 1985 and replaced it with a clay urn she called a vessel. Clara, 5 years old, was taught that eye contact was rebellion and that speaking before being asked was akin to lying. At 6, she memorized entire passages of the soundless gospel, a red binder full of typewritten verses never found in any recognized scripture. At 7, she recited them in her sleep. Her mother tried to leave once, packed a bag, held Clara's hand, walked halfway down the dirt road before a white van pulled up. Sister Madeline spoke to the driver, never raising her voice. Her mother never tried again. Within a month, she was relocated to the Phoenix Fellowship. Clara never saw her again. Micah arrived in the compound when Clara was 11. He was 15, the son of a devout but troubled family from Missouri. He was quiet, even then, not from fear, but from survival. They weren't allowed to speak during transition days. Only after 90 days of proven compliance could you be verbal cleared. Clara watched as Micah remained voiceless for 147. When he finally spoke, it was to recite a hymn perfectly, eyes locked to the ground. Years later, they were paired for marriage by Elijah's decree. Clara accepted, not because she loved him, but because he was the only person who never looked away from her when she cried in silence. Micah carried his own traumas like bricks stacked neatly on a shelf. He never let them fall. After the escape, Clara's first few years in hiding were spent in constant dread. Micah changed jobs every 6 months. They never rented in the same town twice. They communicated with burner phones, encrypted email, aliases. But as the manhunt for Elijah dragged into its 5th year, Micah began to shift. He stopped sleeping, kept the gun under the mattress. He said he saw people from the old assembly in grocery stores, at gas stations. Clara wasn't sure if it was paranoia or truth. But then he showed her something that erased all doubt. A digital flyer, posted on a password-protected assembly mirror site. It showed her photo, pre-raid, smiling in a garden. Beneath it were the words, "The seed who turned to ash. Elijah seeks her restoration." There was a bounty, $100,000. A lie preferred. Micah tightened security. Clara taught Grace to memorize exit routes, to recognize coded phrases, to scream in public if a stranger called her by her middle name. The FBI was notified, but no arrests were made. The Assembly's remaining branches operated like smoke, unregistered, scattered, protected by loopholes and sympathetic fringe lawyers. Then came the knock. Late. 1 a.m. The air was humid. Clara froze as the door rattled softly. Micah opened it with the safety latch still in place. A man stood outside, mid-30s, clean-shaven, casual hoodie, soft eyes. "I'm here for the reconciliation," he said. Micah slammed the door, told Clara to get Grace, told her to run. She didn't want to, not again. But he made her. Clara and Grace slipped out the back, into the night, through the neighbor's gate, into the alley, and into the waiting car Micah had pre-packed a week earlier. She never saw him again. The news reported the incident as a break-in gone wrong. Police found Micah dead on the living room floor. Shot twice. The man was never caught. No cameras. No fingerprints. No known connection. But Clara knew. The reconciliation doctrine allowed cleansing through blood. They had come for her, and they would keep coming. She relocated again. New name, new state. The only thing she kept was a thumb drive Micah had been compiling, his notes, theories, encrypted audio from intercepted sermons, and a folder labeled Foundations. Inside were scanned documents that predated the assembly, letters, maps, typed pages from the soundless gospel with annotations in Elijah's handwriting, and another, unfamiliar name in the margins, Dr. Henry Vale. He was a psychologist in the 1970s, disgraced and exiled from multiple institutions for proposing sensory suppression therapies to treat rebellion in children. He disappeared in 1983. Rumors claimed he joined a commune, changed his identity, and died in a fire. Clara cross-referenced the name with early assembly records. There was a Henry listed as an original listener in the first 12, and his teachings matched the White House rituals exactly. Elijah hadn't just inherited a cult. He'd been born from one. A journalist named Ava Bramwell contacted Clara soon after, claiming to have tracked 3 former disciples of Dr. Vale in South America. She offered Clara a deal, give her access to the Foundation files, and she would share anything she found. Clara agreed. The findings were worse than she imagined. Vale had trained children in isolation tanks, played white noise for weeks, separated twins, removed mirrors, taught selected adults how to implant false quiet memories using suggestion and sleep cycles. When Elijah, then only known as David Eledge, rose through the ranks, he became Vale's vessel. His voice was replicated, his cadence taught to others. Elijah wasn't a prophet. He was a programmed echo of a vanished experiment. Clara's world tilted. Every prayer she had spoken, every ritual she had led, every child she failed to protect. It had all been part of someone else's experiment, and now it was replicating again. Ava leaked the findings. The backlash was seismic. News networks ran specials on cult psychology, comparing assembly tactics to state-sponsored psychological operations. Books were pulled from stores. Members of 2 active fellowships turned themselves in and testified under federal immunity. The case wasn't spiritual anymore. It was scientific, psychological warfare. Clara's name was redacted in most files, but people began to suspect. She received letters again, some grateful, some threatening, and then, one morning, she received a package, a leather-bound book. It looked identical to the soundless gospel, but it was different. The pages were blank, except the first. On it, one sentence. Write what must remain loud. It had no sender, but she didn't need one. Clara closed the blinds, poured herself tea, and sharpened her pencil. She began writing. She wrote for 61 days. Every morning before the sun rose, before gray stirred, before the voices of the world could interrupt her thoughts. The pages filled with memories she'd locked in bone-deep silence, the way Elijah's footsteps slowed when he passed a girl crying, not in empathy, but in assessment, the sound of bare feet running in the field during night drills they called faith chases, the iron silence in her own chest when she was asked to close the door in a room where a child sat alone for 72 hours. She wrote it all, every ritual, every punishment, every prayer that was a command disguised as salvation. She sent the manuscript to Ava under a code name. It leaked in pieces. At first, the public didn't know what to make of it. A Reddit thread, a Medium article, a podcast episode read by an actor. But then the survivors began to recognize themselves in the words. In the girl named Myra, who once slept with nails in a pillow to purge temptation. In the boy who was made to repeat, "I am not my own 10,000 times over week," until he forgot his name. Within 2 weeks, Clara's account, anonymized, watermarked, unsourced, had been read by over 10 million people. She didn't stop writing. She kept going until the silence inside her thinned to something like breath, until she no longer dreamed of closed rooms or Elijah's shadow falling across her face in the chapel light. But freedom is never clean. 3 weeks after the last chapter leaked, a fire erupted at a restoration center in Idaho. 4 dead, 7 hospitalized. Among the survivors was a child with Elijah's symbol tattooed behind his left eye. A man claiming to be Elijah's descendant emerged days later in a grainy live stream, preaching resurrection, silence, and the gospel beyond breath. It wasn't Elijah, but it was enough. People panicked, demanded arrests. One senator called for federal regulation of unlicensed religious communes. Another called it persecution. Survivors clashed with sympathizers. Old assembly members rebranded themselves as reverent separatists, defending Elijah's teachings as misunderstood. Clara stayed quiet, not out of fear, but out of exhaustion. Grace, now 17, had been accepted to college. She wanted to study criminal psychology and become an investigator to help find the ones who were told they didn't matter. She asked her mother if she could use the name Granger. Clara said yes. She didn't need the name anymore. She had reclaimed the sound. But life doesn't honor resolve without testing it. A month after Grace left for school, Clara received a final message. It wasn't a package or letter. It was a recording sent to her inbox through a secure, anonymous file drop. The file name was asher14.wov. She didn't want to open it, but she did. The voice that played was old, ragged, a whisper across broken glass. Clara, my quietest disciple, you made the silence tremble. You taught them to speak, but you forgot it's not the loud ones that survive. It's the ones who can vanish. And I, Clara, have vanished. It ended with static. Clara stayed at the screen. The audio file vanished a moment later. She traced the IP. Argentina. She printed the waveform and burned the paper in a steel bowl by the window. She called no one. She wrote no blog. She just went to her bookshelf, pulled down the soundless gospel, opened the first page, and under "Write what must remain loud," she penned 4 words. I am not yours. Then she closed the book, wrapped it in burlap, and buried it beneath the mesquite tree behind her house. The tree grew crooked. A year passed. Grace returned home for a summer break and brought with her a rough draft of her thesis. It was titled Silence as Weaponry, the American Prophet and the Psychology of Obedience. Clara read it in one night. When she finished, she looked at her daughter and said, "Do you know what I did?" Grace nodded. "And you still love me?" Grace leaned close. "You were a weapon. Now you're a writer." Clara didn't cry, but something inside her cracked open like the spine of an old book. One more chapter remained. She wrote a final letter, not for the world, but for the ones who would someday wonder, for the children in shelters who still wake up screaming with no words for what they lost, for the girls who kneel during sleep, for the boys who cannot speak without asking permission. She wrote, "If you hear this voice, know it is not command. It is echo. You are not marked. You are not chosen. You are not broken. You are loud, and no prophet can ever quiet that again." When Clara died at 63, her ashes were scattered across 3 places: a flower field where the White House once stood, the rooftop of Grace's college dorm, and a paper mill that turned old books into blank pages. One of those blank pages made its way into a reprint of the soundless gospel. Someone scribbled on it, a line that spread across message boards, podcasts, graffiti, and T-shirts for years to come. The prophet fell, the whisper screamed, and the silence bled. The assembly never truly vanished, but it never truly recovered either, because in the end, the gospel didn't survive in silence. It drowned in the sound of Clara's daughter speaking.